Hey guys, I hope you're all well. Today we're talking about frozen shoulder, and by the end of this video I hope that you'll have a really good understanding of what frozen shoulder is and what you can do about it. Now, frozen shoulder is a very complicated condition, so I'm going to break this video down into different sections. The first, we're going to have an overview of what frozen shoulder is and who it affects. Then we're going to discuss a bit about observations and how people move with frozen shoulder. Then we'll go into some anatomy of the shoulder so that you can understand exactly what's going on in relation to you. And then we'll look at some stretches. And then lastly, I'll just briefly touch on some nutritional and lifestyle tips as well. Now, this could potentially be a fairly long video. So if you want to skip straight ahead to whatever section most interests you, then I've put the timestamps up just here so you can just fast forward to wherever you want. Now, just before we do get started, I just want to say that if you are in pain, go and get your shoulder seen to by a doctor or another qualified healthcare practitioner first, who is able to examine and diagnose you. The last thing you want to be doing is using YouTube as a platform to diagnose your own conditions. So go and get it seen to. So anyway, without further ado, let's talk about frozen shoulder. So what exactly is a frozen shoulder? Well, as I said earlier, it is a complicated condition where the mechanisms behind how it develops are not fully understood. But it's characterized by a generalized pain in the shoulder and a progressive loss of mobility. So when assessing patients, they often have very non-specific pain around the shoulder, and they will have difficulties in moving their arms in all directions, as I'm showing you here. You will often see patients compensating in the body in order to improve their reach. So you'll often find them shrugging their shoulder or bending their spine as a way to try and get their arm to move in more range. Frozen shoulder typically affects women more than it does men, with about 1.4 women to every 1 man being affected by frozen shoulder. And typically you're looking between the ages of 40 and 65 who are the most commonly affected. Now, there are many different names for frozen shoulder, with adhesive capsulitis being the most frequently used. However, the medical profession seem to be moving further and further away from using that terminology. So we will just tend to stick to frozen shoulder, especially for the use of this video. Now, you can get 2 types of frozen shoulder, primary or secondary. A primary frozen shoulder is with an unknown cause. It has just developed with seemingly no reason. A secondary frozen shoulder is when you can usually attribute it to a certain trauma or surgery or medical condition, most commonly hyper or hypothyroidism, high cholesterol or diabetes. Now, regardless of whether a frozen shoulder is primary or secondary, it typically follows 3 phases. The first is called the freezing stage, the second is the frozen, and then the third is the thawing phase. So phase 1, the freezing phase, is also known as the painful stage because typically this is the most painful stage of all. It is characterized by an aching, generalized pain with progressive loss of mobility in the joint. Now, this stage can last anywhere between 3 to 8 months, and patients often have difficulties in pinpointing the exact location of the problem. And during this phase, it's also common for spasms to occur, such as in the trapezius or the neck. Pain is often worse at night, and patients will often find that they're woken up throughout the night, especially if they roll over onto that affected side. They will often also have difficulties in doing certain basic daily movements, such as reaching into the back pocket to try and get the wallet, or reaching behind to try and fasten up a bra, or even trying to just simply brush their hair. It is also possible for pain to radiate away from the shoulder, such as down the arm or up into the neck. And both passive and active range of motion is lost. So passive is when I, as a practitioner, might be trying to feel how much that shoulder can move, and active is how much you can move it with your own muscles. And the most common movements that are affected are abduction with external rotation, so for example brushing your hair, or extension with an internal rotation, such as trying to get that wallet out of your pocket. So phase 2 is known as the frozen stage or the adhesive stage, and during this phase patients will often report that there's less pain, but there's also a lot less movement as well. Now, although there's less pain, anytime a patient tries to move their arm into any extremity, they will definitely feel pain. Now, this phase typically lasts between 4 to 6 months, although I have seen a lot longer. Now, lastly is phase 3, and this is the recovery phase, also known as the thawing phase. Now, this can happen spontaneously, and there's no particular known explanation as to when it happens or why it happens. But this phase can last anywhere between 6 to 24 months. There will gradually be an increase in the range of motion, and also pain will be fairly minimal during this phase. But there can be periods of time when pain does increase, but this is only temporarily. So now we have briefly discussed what frozen shoulder is and how it appears. We're now going to go and have a look at some of the anatomy of the shoulder, and I'm going to explain how the anatomy relates to what's going on with frozen shoulder. Alright guys, so what we have here are two models of shoulder joints. This is a right shoulder and this is a left shoulder. So almost as though you were looking at me and we've taken everything away apart from my shoulders. So this is the front of both shoulders, and so if we spin them around, this is the back. Now we're going to look at this one here first. This is representing the rotator cuff muscles. So we've got 4 muscles: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and the subscapularis. We're not going to discuss the muscles themselves. If you want to learn a bit more about the muscles, go and check out my other video, Understanding Shoulder Pain and How to Fix It, where I describe what these muscles do. But what I want to show you is that if we take these muscles away and we strip this joint right back to only the joint, what you can see here is the humerus. So this is your upper arm bone, and this is the scapula. So this is the front and this is the back. If you look over here, you can see the joint. So the joint is made up of something called a ball and socket joint. The head of the humerus is known as the ball, and then this glenoid fossa, that's what this is called here, the glenoid fossa, is known as the socket. In order to maintain freedom of movement, within every joint is something called synovial fluid. And what this fluid does is it allows friction-free movement between the surfaces of the two joints, or the two bones. But in order to keep this fluid within the joint, the body needs to keep it there. So it encloses this joint in something known as a capsule. The capsule is a fibrous sac that keeps this fluid within. Now this capsule is relatively inelastic, but in the shoulder it's actually quite loose, so it allows freedom of movement. But if this joint was to gap too much, it will become tighter and tighter. You know, like if you had a piece of cloth and you stretched it, there's only so much it will stretch. So that's what happens in normal shoulders. It prevents excessive gapping. However, in frozen shoulder, that's what causes the restriction in movement. So let me just show you now what this capsule looks a bit more like. So if we bring this one over here, you've got the scapula again and the humerus bone. If you just have a look at the front side here, this is the front side of the capsule. If we spin this around, you can see the back side of the capsule, and it goes all the way around the whole joint. So this is the underside here. In normal shoulders, it's this underside portion that's relatively lax. But in frozen shoulder, it's this that becomes tightened, it becomes restricted. There are a few things to point out. This here is part of the muscle of the infraspinatus, and then around the front, which is the muscle that's been cut of the subscapularis. So these two muscles cause internal and external rotation in your shoulder. So imagine you've got your elbow down by your side and you take your hand out, that's external rotation, and if you bring your hand in, that's internal rotation. So these two muscles here are responsible for that rotation. If we look at the side, this green blob-like thing here is called a bursa. Now a bursa is a fluid-filled sac, and what it does is it allows freedom of movement between the two structures. It could be between two muscles or between a muscle and some ligaments, for example. This is the subacromial bursa here. The reason why I've pointed that out is because in frozen shoulder, what happens is the underside of this capsule becomes restricted, it becomes fibrous, it becomes tightened, but also this subacromial bursa becomes thickened as well. And also, I don't know if you can see, but just in there is a ligament. It's that number 8 ligament just there. This is called the coracohumeral ligament. And this also becomes thickened and fibrous as well. So we have the capsule, the bursa and the ligament that all become thickened. Now, what's also worth mentioning is that the subscapularis muscle, so the front muscle of this shoulder blade, also seems to become thickened and tightened. So it's these 4 structures that become tightened in frozen shoulder, and that's what restricts the movements. So speaking of movements, let's go and have a look at what the movements are like with people who have frozen shoulder, and then we'll go into some stretches as well. Okay, so in terms of movements, these are the movements that people struggle with frozen shoulder. We have flexion. Now this is a normal range of flexion from here to here. When people have frozen shoulder, it can often be about as much as this. Then we have abduction. So this is taking the arm away from us and all the way up to the ceiling. People with frozen shoulder can get to usually about 90 degrees. Then you start to see this shoulder hitching up and then they start to bend over. Then we have extension. This is a normal range of extension. People with frozen shoulder end up being just to about here. Then we have coupled movements, things such as abduction and external rotation. So that would be like brushing hair. Now people with frozen shoulder may only be able to get to about here. Then we have extension and internal rotation. People with frozen shoulder tend to just be able to get to the gluteal fold or even just slightly above, but very rarely any higher than that. So now what we're going to do is go through all of those ranges of motions in terms of stretches. I'm going to show you a few different variations for each movement. Now you don't have to do every single stretch for each movement, just do the ones that feel the best for you.